So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming to this teach-in on the war in Ukraine. What a good audience, thank you. And I'm here on behalf of the Marie Colvin Center for International Reporting, and I just want to start by saying a few words about Marie. Marie was my colleague for many years at the Sunday Times of London, and also came from just down the road in Long Island, from Oyster Bay. And she gave her life 10 years ago this year, reporting on the atrocities in Syria. She came under fire from President Assad's forces and was killed. Marie felt it was very important to bear witness, to take risks where necessary, to report the truth about war. And she used to say very humbly, "It's what we do." Many of her colleagues are now in Ukraine reporting on the war there. And I just wanted to say as well a few words from her friend Lindsay Hilsum, who was here at Stony Brook for a while and wrote Marie's biography and is currently in Ukraine reporting on the war for Channel 4 News. And she said this about this event. She said, "Here in Ukraine, we miss Marie's reporting so much." And she added, "I miss Marie. This event sounds great," she said, "and I'd really hope we can do her words of confidence justice." We've certainly got a fantastic panel here, and I'm going to start by introducing the journalists that you can see behind me on Zoom. And then later I'll introduce our in-person, very distinguished panel from Stony Brook University. So first up is going to be Michael Slackman. Now, Michael is the international news editor of the New York Times. He has covered wars himself in Iraq. He's been a correspondent in Egypt. He's been in Moscow, and he's been in Berlin. But right now, he's one of the busiest men on the planet trying to coordinate the New York Times's coverage of the war. And we're very grateful to him for being here to tell us about the New York Times's coverage of Ukraine and the challenges. And then next, we're going to hear from Louise Callahan, who you can see behind me there. Now, Louise is the inheritor of Marie Colvin's mantle at the Sunday Times of London. She is the Middle East correspondent for that newspaper, based in Istanbul and reporting from Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, all over the Middle East. But of course, for the last month, she's been stationed in Ukraine. She was there at the outbreak of the war and has done some incredible reporting since then on the course of the war in Ukraine. She briefly came out of Ukraine to get some respite. She was rotated out, and she is literally just now on her way back in the country. She'll tell us, but I think she's joining us from Romania because, of course, it's no easy task to even find your way back into Ukraine, but she'll be there in the next 24 hours and back on the front line. And finally, among our journalist guests, we're very privileged to have Simon Ostrowski. Now, he's Russian-born and is the special correspondent for PBS NewsHour. And Simon was kidnapped by pro-Russian militias back in 2014, reporting on the Russian invasion of the Crimea. And in a sense, what we're witnessing today is the continuation of that same war in Ukraine. And he's also just back, he's just got back to New York, in fact, from Moldova, and he's also been in Poland, two countries which are very fearful for their future following this war. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to start talking to Michael Slackman, and I just want to say that this event is not being live streamed, but it will be on YouTube later. It is being videoed. So please do tell everybody about it. So Michael, I'm going to start with you. Hello.
Hi.
Good stuff. You can hear me.
Can you hear me okay? Can everyone hear me okay?
Excellent, Michael.
Yes, loud and clear. So, Michael, this is one of the most important wars of our lifetime, and you're responsible for putting together the all-important first draft of history for the New York Times, one of the great global newspapers. How do you feel about the challenges that that involves? How's it been, you know, what's it like to be in your job at this moment?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having us and all of us and for drawing attention to what, as you rightly identify, is probably the most consequential conflict we've seen in our lifetimes. Hard to imagine because just a few months ago, the Taliban were victorious in Afghanistan. Tens of thousands of people had to evacuate. A 20-year US operation there went down the tubes. Hard to imagine that something of greater consequence has come up, but it has. But if you don't mind, I want to correct one thing. I am not the busiest man in the world. The people that deserve your attention and focus are really the brave correspondents, reporters, videographers, audio people who are on the ground in Ukraine right now. This is not a war that like we have seen before. Reporters don't have the ability to embed with the stronger side. They don't have the opportunity to be behind a particular line because what they are is living with the Ukrainians. You know, they are living in Kiev, they're living in Odessa, they're living in Lviv. They are in the same places that are being pummeled by indiscriminate shooting from the Russians. So I really want to draw your attention to them. You know, reporters, some journalists sometimes don't have the best reputations from a public that doesn't always understand what they're doing. I hope everybody understands that we've already seen 3 or 4 people die, journalists in Ukraine, and that what they're experiencing is very, very dangerous. And they're doing it, as you said, to bear witness, to hold the powerful people to account, to give voice to people who would otherwise be slaughtered in silence. And to me, that's like an extraordinarily powerful and important mission that deserves our respect. You can't have democracy without informed citizens. You can't expect the world to stay as united or part of it to stay as united as it has against this unprovoked aggression without those correspondents on the ground. So please have your thoughts and prayers with them, not with me. I'm in New Jersey, which has its own risks. So I'm not.
Yes, thank you for that. And how do you keep your journalists safe to the best of your ability? Because this is a very, very challenging war for them.
I mean, look, in any conflict, what we try to do in any assignment, we weigh the journalistic mission versus the risk. And you can't eliminate risk, but you can try to minimize it. In this case, we have all of our people working with security advisors who are focusing on logistics. They're advisors, not guards. They're not armed. The idea is when your head is down in your notebook or you're looking through the viewfinder of a camera, that somebody is paying attention around you, somebody who has experience in military actions. So everybody is with somebody. And you know, we take calculated risks, but we try to avoid being put in circumstances where you're surrounded or unable to escape. In a conflict like this, where the Russian military has become bogged down, it's unable to take major cities, and it has had to rely on tactics of indiscriminate bombing. At a certain level, there is no way to eliminate risk. You know, a mall in Kiev is hit by a missile. A training center in Lviv is hit by a missile. Grad rockets are fired into places like Kharkiv. You know, I don't know if they're using cluster bombs in Mariupol, but they might as well be. There's a very brave team of journalists from the Associated Press who got out of Mariupol by the skin of their teeth. Their account in the AP was harrowing. So at a certain point, you know, really the hardest part of this job for me, as I'm sure it is for every editor involved in this, is sleeping. You know, we worry greatly that our correspondents are in harm's way and will fall victim to indiscriminate random violence of a Russian military that has decided that the way to try to win this war is to break the spirit and the will of the people by randomly destroying civilian infrastructure and killing civilians, men, women, and children, old, young, it doesn't matter.
That's a really sobering thought. Tell me as well about your Moscow coverage. You're a former Moscow correspondent. It's very difficult to get to the truth of what's happening out there to Russian people, isn't there, and beyond. How are you dealing with those challenges?
Well, there's two sides to that question. One is what the Russian government has done, and the Duma, the legislature there, is they've criminalized independent reporting, independent journalism when it comes to Ukraine. What they've said is, if you're not familiar with the legislation, first of all, anything that's fake is deemed treasonous, which is punishable by up to 15 years in prison. And the Kremlin is the sole arbiter of what is fake. It's not like they can accuse you of filing something that's fake and you can take it to a court and adjudicate it. The second thing is you can't call it a war. It has to be a special operation. The third thing is you can't quote anybody anonymously. You're restricted to only quoting those people that the government puts forward to talk to. And you can't use social media. Bottom line, what they're trying to do is they can't win the war of ideas. So they're trying to keep out a whole school of thinking and knowledge of what's happening in Ukraine. They're trying to keep that from Russian citizens. I felt that the risk was too high for my Russian colleagues who worked for the New York Times in Russia. We could neither report the war accurately, report what was happening in Russia accurately, without the risk of a 15-year prison sentence. And so we pulled everybody out. We moved all of our journalistic staff to Istanbul. These are people who have been committed journalists and worked in Russia for a very long time, have lots of relationships, and know plenty of people across the country. Our bureau chief, Anton Trainovsky, who's a fluent Russian speaker, had just done a 3,000-mile car ride across Russia. So we are able to call in and talk to people. It's not the same as being there. And I know some journalistic outfits have made the calculation that the Russian government has enough troubles. It's not going to put them in prison. I'm not that confident that they won't do that. So we're doing the best that we can right now. You know, using the word war risks 15 years in prison. And to my mind, that the odds, the balance was against staying. The second most important thing that we have to do is make sure we don't get Russians who are living there who talk to us and inform us about what's actually happening on the ground. We can't get them in trouble either. So it's very challenging. I hope we go back. You know, we have not suspended operations as some other organizations have. We've taken a pause and we're waiting and seeing how this law is ultimately implemented. It was just extended yesterday so that it includes all government agencies, not just those involved in the conflict. But I'm hopeful that you know, saner minds prevail and we can go back.
So I noticed that even today you had a very good story though about Russia. So you're continuing to get very good sources of information out of there. How do you see this war developing? Is there an end game, do you think? How pessimistic or optimistic are you that this can be resolved?
Look, when I was a reporter for the Los Angeles Times and I was in Baghdad, I didn't think the US would actually invade. So please don't ask me to look into my crystal ball. I'm not particularly good at it, and it's not actually what my role is. I'm not going to prognosticate. I mean, just reading as events are going and judging President Putin by his comments, you know, where he seems to have stepped up the invective. He's made it anybody in Russia who is not with him is against him. What was the word he used? Scum. It doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon. And I think that the people of Ukraine are in for a long haul. Even if the war would end tomorrow, the degree of devastation and the loss of life is profound. 1 in 5 Ukrainians have been forced to flee their homes. It's a country of 44 million people. This is tremendously disruptive. So again, even if it ended today, it's going to have a long tail, and it doesn't seem even close to ending today.
Thank you, Michael, so much for your important perspective. I'm going to turn now to Louise Callahan. And firstly, Louise, tell us where you are, because I know you're making your way back to Ukraine now.
Are you able to slowly but surely
about your location or not yet?
Yeah. No, of course. I'm in Romania, in a strange border town on my way over. So hopefully tomorrow I'm going to get on the ferry and go across the Danube. And then I'll end up in Ukraine and be able to start working again.
Well, I really salute your courage. Is it scary, the thought that you might be going back into a heavier situation than you left only about a week ago?
Well, I was thinking about this, and it's always a really strange mix of emotions going into one of these conflict zones, because of course you're scared. You have to be really, really crazy not to be scared, but at the same time you're kind of you know, stressed, thinking about the work that you're going to do. You're excited to see the people that you know who are there, your sources, your friends, your colleagues. You're looking forward to seeing what's developed in the story. And so, because of course, as horrific as this war is, and as harshly as every death and every destruction of every building affects you, then there is also a kind of fascination that you have as a journalist in seeing everything develop in front of you and seeing history being made, this first draft of history occurring. And also Ukrainians that you speak to, they want you to be there as an international journalist. So in that sense, you feel bad when you leave, and you want to go back because you want to be able to tell their stories.
So you were in Kiev already when the war broke out. You're effectively in position. We were all hoping at the time that nothing would happen, that Putin wouldn't invade, but of course he did. What was it like to see a big city go from a modern European location into a war zone?
Well, it was incredibly strange. That's all I can say, really. I mean, I've covered several conflicts before, and so have many of the journalists who are also covering the situation here. And of course, Ukraine has been at war for 8 years. You know, there's no denying that. But it was happening in the east. It was hundreds of miles away. And for a lot of people living in Kiev, they hadn't experienced a conflict situation before. They knew about it. They'd heard about it. They might have relatives there, but it's just not something that had affected them personally. And then so the day before the war, actually the evening before the war, the strike started at 5 a.m. The evening before that, I was out in Kiev, walking around, talking to people. And I remember I stopped a girl on the street. She was 22, 23 or something. She's a film director. I stopped her on the street and I said, hey, it looks like the war's going to start. What do you think is going to happen? And she was like, yeah, I don't think so. I just think it's all a bit overblown. And what I'm really worried about is, you know, getting funding for my film that I want to make in Ukraine, which, you know, should start filming in the next few months. So that's what she was thinking about. And that's, I spoke to a lot of people like that who just made no contingency plans at all for the war starting. They hadn't done things like taken cash out, bought medicines, stocked up on food, taped their windows, all that stuff that if you really felt that there was a conflict about to start, that you would do. A lot of people just genuinely did not believe that it would happen, and then it did.
And what has affected you most, do you think, as a reporter, the scenes you have witnessed?
I think that one of the really, really difficult things to see, but more importantly to live through, that, you know, the people that this is happening to, is just the feeling of your future disappearing, all plans that you had evaporating, your family having, you know, one moment had thoughts for the future, you had a job, you have a house, you have a career, and then it's gone. That seeing people have that realization, I think, is one of the, it's incredibly difficult to watch. It feels important to record, but it's a really, really striking thing where you really did just see people overnight going from being, you know, doctors, lawyers, baristas, middle-class professionals, and overnight becoming refugees and leaving everything they had behind.
And Louise, how does it compare with some of the reporting that you've done in the Middle East? You've covered the fall of ISIS and other important stories. What do you think? Every war is different, of course, and every war is a tragedy. This was different for me compared to the conflicts that I've covered before. The biggest difference, I think, was how in Iraq and in Syria before the war against ISIS began, a lot of places were already very fragile and conflict affected. People had, unfortunately, had to learn to live with that. Millions of people had already fled. Whereas in Kiev, especially, you could really, and in a lot of Western Ukraine, you really saw somewhere go from being any normal European city to the next minute
everything being very different. So that it was different in that sense. I think the other difference is, as Michael mentioned, that it's the much kind of militarily better equipped side is the other side. So and also you just have absolutely no idea where the lines are. That's another really, really striking thing, is that it's so mobile. So you can go one day, you're driving down the road and it's absolutely fine, and then by that afternoon there's a new checkpoint, and that checkpoint, they, you know, it might be Russian soldiers, or, you know, and there's just so much confusion as well. That's the other thing. So as well as these really mobile lines, and as well as the superior firepower of the Russians, there's also a real security concern for a lot of journalists, in that there's a lot of fear of Russian saboteurs working within Ukraine. So there's both the risk of, you know, people, Russian soldiers pretending to be Ukrainians doing some kind of attack inside Ukraine. There's the risk of that. But I think more strikingly, there's also the fear of Ukrainian fighters that that's going to happen. So people are very, very jumpy, very nervous. There's a lot of people who have picked up assault rifles who didn't even, you know, a month ago, they didn't know how to use a gun, and now they have one. And people are very, very nervous, very afraid of Russian saboteurs turning up. So that's another security risk that you really have to think about when you're moving around in Ukraine now.
You've seen so much tragedy unfolding in Ukraine. Is there anything that makes you feel in any way hopeful about humanity when you're witnessing such a war going on?
Yeah, actually there was, I mean, a lot. I mean, the resilience of people, the way that people stay positive, and the way that people help each other in these situations is, you know, whichever conflict you're covering is always incredibly inspiring. But there was particularly one moment where I really felt that a couple of weeks ago. I was in a place called Mykolaiv, which is quite close to the fighting on the southern front. And I went to a hospital, maternity hospital, where women were being taken to give birth. And the crazy thing was that the lucky women, the ones, you know, who were having a good birth where things were going naturally, they were in the shelter. So if you could give birth in a shelter, you were the lucky one, because if you had to have an operation, or if your birth was more complicated, then they took you upstairs. And upstairs in the operating theatre, there was a very high risk of bombardment at that time. It was close to the lines. Anyway, so but speaking to the doctors there and the nurses and the midwives, they've basically, a lot of them have just left their families at home, and they are living in the hospital under the risk of bombardment, working pretty much 24/7, just kind of snatching a nap in the shelter when they can, in order to try and keep their patients alive. And when I asked one of the doctors, you know, I said, this is so incredibly brave. What is it that motivates you? And he said, I just have no choice but to be brave. He really genuinely felt that he was just in this situation, that was his job, and he was just going to do it. I mean, that's really an incredibly moving thing for me.
Honestly, we could say the same words about you, Louise, just being incredibly brave and just having to do it. And I think everybody in this room, their hearts are in their mouths thinking of you going back into that country. But, you know, thank you for doing that, for bearing witness. And so, yes, thank you, Louise. And I'm now going to turn to Simon. Simon is a very distinguished documentary maker. And as I mentioned early on, Simon, you really experienced the rough end of what could be said to be the start of this war, didn't you, back in 2014? Can you tell us about what was going on there? Because I think for a lot of people, this conflict has emerged out of the blue, but actually it has very long antecedents. And tell us about your experience.
Well, that's right. And also, thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here and have the opportunity to speak to all of you. In 2014, when Russia essentially sent its military to Crimea in order to annex that peninsula, I had been working for Vice, and Vice had just gotten into the news business because up until then it was doing mostly documentaries. And so we sort of started our news reporting off with this incident, which I read about on Twitter, I think, and mentioned it to my boss and said we should go to Ukraine and see what's happening over there. And I had no idea that 8 years later, we'd still be talking about the same conflict that started then. But I was actually kidnapped in eastern Ukraine after the annexation of Crimea, when Russia stoked this conflict over there between what it wanted to portray as Russian speakers who were being oppressed by the Ukrainians, and then people who were loyal to the central government of Ukraine. Of course, that narrative about the war in Ukraine has never been true, because so many people who are Russian speaking back then and especially now are fighting on the Ukraine side, because the way I see it, it's actually a conflict between two worldviews rather than two ethnic or linguistic groups. It's a conflict between people who support Russian-style autocracy and people who support Western-style democracy. And the Ukrainians are obviously in the latter camp. And so there are tens of thousands of people who are Russian-speaking who are fighting for those ideals. And they're on the front line of fighting against autocracy internationally, in my personal opinion. And when the artificial uprising that was stoked by the Kremlin started happening in towns throughout eastern Ukraine, which was an area that had been neglected for a very long time, because Ukraine itself wasn't a terribly rich country, and this was a pretty poor region of an already poor country. Town after town seemed to be falling to these pro-Russia separatists, who it later emerged were led by both current and retired Russian security services officers. And in the city of Slavyansk, which was one of the first to go down, there was a group led by a man named Igor Girkin, who went by the nom de guerre Strelkov, who was a former Russian FSB officer who was running things from the former KGB headquarters in the town, which later became the Ukrainian SBU headquarters, and then he took it over and made it into the Donetsk People's Republic Defense Ministry, but kept the prison downstairs intact. And that's where I essentially ended up, because I had been going to press conferences on a daily basis that were being put together by the people's mayor of Slavyansk, and asking questions that were not, that he was not pleased with. I mean, in addition to that, our reporting for Vice News at the time didn't rely very heavily on voiceover, and a lot of the interviews that I was doing were in Russian. And so a lot of the people in the region were following our reporting because they could understand it. So they knew what my reporting was all about. And, we were exposing these truths about what was happening in Eastern Ukraine. And I guess the new authorities of Slavyansk decided that they wanted to send a message to all of the other journalists there about what is and isn't okay to report. And so they distributed my photograph to all of the checkpoints in the area, which had sprung up in the previous week. And you had to go through these checkpoints in order to get anywhere. And when I was at the last one that was closest to our hotel, the man at the checkpoint shined a flashlight in my face. I was driving, compared it to a photograph that he'd had in his pocket, and was like, "This is the guy, he's the guy." So I ended up being detained and taken to that cellar at the former KGB headquarters and held there for 3 days. It was a really bad experience. Obviously, I was blindfolded pretty much the entire time. And then I found out after the whole ordeal that I had actually been interrogated and questioned by Strelkov himself, who I had no idea, who he was at the time, but he became quite, a prominent figure later on. And that was only because he'd given an interview to Roland Oliphant of the Telegraph newspaper, and told him that he'd interrogated me, which I had no idea about because, again, I was blindfolded, and I didn't know who these people were anyway. So
what a terrifying experience.
Yeah, it was really scary, but luckily there was a lot of media attention on my case, and I'm very grateful to my colleagues, many of whom were there in Slavyansk at the time, who publicized it. And somebody decided, probably up in Moscow, that this was a bad look for the so-called separatist movement. It was released, but the people who were down there in the cellar with me weren't until until weeks or months later when the Ukrainians managed to take that city back. And what I'm thinking about now as this next step of the war rages on is all of the people who are continuing to be kidnapped by the Russian forces as they move across Ukraine, as they take major cities, quite, I guess, notoriously in the last couple of weeks, there was an incident with the mayor of the city of Kherson in southern Ukraine who was kidnapped, and many others who we'll never hear about. And knowing about the kind of treatment that the Russians are capable of firsthand, that's what really concerns me the most. And what I was thinking about when this war first started was how many people are going to end up being put through the meat grinder in ways that most of us can't even imagine. Yeah,
that's a really important observation. You also knew Brent Renaud, the documentary maker, the American documentary maker who died recently in Ukraine. 2 other Western journalists were also killed. Can you just tell us a few words about him? Because I'd just like to honor his memory and those of the other journalists.
Yeah, I worked with Brent on a piece we did about the attempt by ISIS to take over Libya in 2015. And it was quite a dangerous shoot. And even though it happened after my experience in Ukraine, I've rarely been more terrified by anything in my life. And I felt like, to Brent, it was just kind of old hat. He was really cool as a cucumber the entire time. And he's also the type of person who doesn't say a lot and kind of just gets on with it. And so he just sort of seemed unfazed throughout the entire time. But it's hard to overstate just how incredible a filmmaker Brent was. And long before I worked with him in 2015 and long before this war in Ukraine now, he'd been doing amazing documentaries that kind of pretty much won every award there is in the book. And although I didn't know him very well, because we'd only worked together that one time briefly, still has kind of a strange effect on you when you realize that somebody you knew personally was just wiped out and erased in this terrible way, and that you'll never have the opportunity to see them or work with them again. And so I guess, my regret was that I didn't have the opportunity to work with him more. But I was really thinking.
Thank you for that. Can I also just ask you to talk briefly about Ukraine's neighbors, Moldova, that you've just returned to? How afraid are they of getting sucked into a much bigger war?
Well, the thing I was struck by in Poland and Moldova was, first of all, something that was happening in both places, which is this incredible outpouring of sympathy for the plight of the Ukrainians who are fleeing into their countries, and how those two countries have really pulled together to try to do as much as possible for the people who are arriving in a way that I've never seen happen in my entire career anywhere. Moldova in particular, unlike Poland and the other countries in Europe that are accepting Ukrainian refugees, is not a member of NATO or the European Union, and it's also one of the poorest countries in Europe. And so they have a lot fewer resources to help Ukrainian people. Nonetheless, they've been doing everything that they possibly can. And we were speaking with members of the government over there who were saying that they had prepared for about 15,000 people. 20,000 people was the capacity that they had to take care of. And right now they're dealing with a situation where they've already had 360,000 people come through their borders. Only about 100,000 of those people have actually stayed in Moldova, but these are sort of the most vulnerable people who don't have the means to go on to the European Union. And so that's already, 4, 5, or 6 times the capacity that Moldova was prepared for. And I think, if Moldova doesn't get help soon from the international community, the situation there is going to get very difficult indeed. And international humanitarian organizations which deal with these situations on a regular basis say is that initially there's always an outpouring of goodwill towards the refugees, but eventually that dissipates, and there's a potential for it to turn ugly. And I've noticed that there is an online campaign in Moldova in particular to try to smear Ukrainian refugees with some of the same ugly lies that pro-Russia sources have said about Ukrainians within Ukraine in the past, which is that they are trying to force Russian speakers to speak Ukrainian or to stop speaking Russian. And so there have been just dozens of videos shared, hundreds of videos, in fact, shared around Moldova, which are essentially all saying the same thing. Like they're singing from the same prayer sheet, trying to smear the arriving Ukrainian refugees as being aggressive towards Russian speakers in Moldova. So
thank you, Simon, because I think one of the important points there is that we're not just in a shooting war, and of course that is the worst aspect of all this, but we're also in a propaganda war. And it's really important for the truth to come out, which is why I'm so grateful to all three of you for joining us today and sharing your wisdom about that. I know you've all got important things to do, so I'm going to let you go. Louise, safe travels into Ukraine, and Simon and Michael will continue to follow your coverage with enormous interest, and thank you for what you're doing there. We're going to move to the in-person part of the panel now. I hope if they're still listening, they can tell how much we appreciated their contributions. So thank you for that applause. Now, we're very lucky here to have a great in-person panel from Stony Brook University itself. There's so much knowledge and wisdom right here on campus. This is just a small fraction of the talent at Stony Brook, who really are very knowledgeable about so many aspects of this. I'm going to start, I'm going to introduce you all and then turn to each speaker. So to my left here is Professor Alexander Orloff, and he's a professor of materials science and chemistry, but he is also from Ukraine. He has family in Ukraine. Quite a few members of his family have been forced to flee the bombing, and he's also been an expert advisor on a number of matters to the EU Parliament and also to the British government on Ukraine and other matters. So that's Professor Orloff. Next to him we have the distinguished Professor of Political Science, Leonie Hadid, who is going to talk about the domestic US political implications. She's an expert on public opinion and politics, and it'd be great to hear her talk. We have Professor Jonathan Sanders, who is from the School of Journalism right here in Stony Brook. But beyond that is also a former Moscow correspondent for CBS News and has actually met Vladimir Putin personally. And this is really one man's terrible war, so his insight is going to be valuable on that. And John Frederick Bailyn, who told me he considers St. Petersburg to be his second home. He's a professor of linguistics of Slavic languages here at Stony Brook. For many years, he's been running the New York St. Petersburg Global Institute, and he also has taken so many students from Stony Brook to Russia. It must be breaking his heart to find that that is no longer possible right now, thanks to this terrible war. But anyway, we'll be hearing from each of these professors in turn. Professor Orloff, I'd like to start with you. This time I'm going to take a back seat. I'm not going to ask any more questions. They're going to share their wisdom. And then please do ask questions at the end when they finish speaking. Professor Orloff, over to you.
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. And I really appreciate the invitation to join this panel. Even though I've been teaching at Stony Brook for 14 years, and as was mentioned, I was advising the UK Prime Minister's office on Ukraine around 10 years ago. I would like to talk about this from my personal perspective and the personal angle. I have American, British, and Ukrainian passports. I was born in Ukraine. My last name is Russian. I studied in the United States, UK, and Ukraine. And I am the type of person Putin is claiming he is protecting in Ukraine. My origin is from St. Petersburg. In my Ukrainian passport, somehow I'm listed as Russian and I speak both languages. So this protection by Putin is actually bombing my parents and relatives. And from his perspective, people like me and my parents do not deserve to live, do not deserve to have their homes and dreams unless they're part of the Russian regime. So during the first couple of days of invasion, my mom told me that she can distinguish the ballistic missiles from artillery fire because both were flying near her window. Yesterday she told me that when the missile was flying near her kitchen, if she hits her house, she would like to die quickly. So you can imagine if you hear something like that from your parents, and that's really horrendous. They're now refugees. They left Ukrainian capital. They're in Western Ukraine, in Lviv. They still go to bomb shelter every day. So it's still fairly scary. Many of my relatives are in different parts of Ukraine. One of them is pediatric neurosurgeon in Kiev, in the largest children's hospital. In the first couple of days, Russians actually sent a rocket towards that hospital, and thanks God it was intercepted. So you can imagine what would happen if it hit that place with a lot of sick children. And so Simon said that I'm the type of Ukrainian who Putin is trying to protect. There's one very hurtful part of the propaganda where Russians call Ukrainian Nazis. This is so offensive to memory of 7 million Ukrainians who died during the World War II. It included 1.5 million Ukrainian soldiers who were fighting Germans and died. It included 1 million Jews who were exterminated in Ukraine by Germans. So when you hear about Ukrainians being starved in Mariupol, it's actually not the first time in Ukrainian history when Russians desecrated Ukrainians. You have to understand that Ukrainians are freedom-loving people and fairly independent. In 1932 and 1933, Russia tried to absorb Ukraine, and Bolsheviks decided to break the will of Ukrainian farmers. What they've done, they ship all the food from Ukraine to Russia, and 4 million of them died. So that's very similar to what you see in Mariupol. Ukrainians are fighting for all of us. If Ukraine fails, Putin can continue with the rest of the world, and maybe none of us over here would be alive. It continues to the end. You can imagine that what he issued the nuclear threats, he started threatening NATO countries, and that is immensely scary. If you talk to Ukrainian soldiers, they tell you that they can defeat Russian troops on land, but they cannot defeat it in the air. In fact, America and Israel, they have the weapons which can reach the bombers, which is currently impossible to reach by the current Ukrainian weapons. And they're pleading for that help to protect the Ukrainian cities and Ukrainians. I talked to my mom yesterday and asked her about her biggest fear. And she told me the biggest fear she has is to be forgotten by the West, because at some point you might get tired with images of human suffering and stop paying attention. Mm-hmm. However, Ukrainians need to live with that threat even if they defeat Russian troops at this stage. And they need your friendship, compassion, and support of all of you. Ukrainians are like you. They want freedom, they want to have a free enterprise, and they want to dream. Many of the Ukrainians who are fighting right now, they're age of Stony Brook students, and they never hold the held the rifles in their lives. If I was in Ukraine at this stage, I would probably join them, but I have to teach at Stony Brook. So I hope you would not forget Ukrainians who are fighting for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Orloff. That was so moving. Over to you, John Boylan. I'd love to hear your remarks now.
Thank you. It's very moving, Alex. So terrible, the stories that are going on. It's difficult for me to talk about the Russian side of things at all, because it pales in comparison to what's happening in Ukraine, and I want to say that at the beginning. The institute that I directed or co-directed met every summer in St. Petersburg for 17 years, from all of those years during the Putin regime, from 2003 to 2019, until it was stopped only because of COVID. There's people in this room who attended it as faculty and as students and as members of the global office and as graduate assistants and so on. And this institute was an international institute with linguistics, but also cultural studies with students from the US, students from Ukraine, students from Georgia, students from Kazakhstan, all over the former Soviet Union, and about 50 to 60% of the students from all over Russia. They would come to St. Petersburg from the Far East, Khabarovsk, from Tomsk in Siberia, from Astrakhan in the south, from Nizhny Novgorod on the Volga, from Kaliningrad in the west. So this is, it wasn't just the central cities. It took place in St. Petersburg. There were students from Iran, students from Pakistan, students from the Middle East. It was and we felt that we were really bringing people together to have a dialogue about not only linguistics, which is my field, but also cultural studies, especially queer studies, issues of nationalism, trauma studies, things that were not normally discussed in the Russian institutions. And there was a very open discussion of these things, up to and including the last time we met in person, which was 2019, and then we went virtual, and it has met 4 times, 2 summers and 2 winters since then, and now we are a global virtual institute. So the institute still exists, but it is no longer a Russian-American joint project as it was. And the last time it met was January 2022, a couple of weeks before the invasion. And I was in St. Petersburg at the time, and it was virtual, but I led the institute from St. Petersburg, and the level of student engagement on all of these issues, very complicated issues of cultural studies with all sorts of sensitive topics, was very open and included Russian students from all over the country and from all over the former Soviet Union. Everything changed inside Russia on February 24th, 2022. Those same students who could speak openly at that institute now could walk out the door, and just because they're wearing a flower in their hair or a backpack, could be put in a police van and taken away and put in jail. That was not true just a couple of weeks ago. That is a significant change. There was, of course, some repression in the Russian society, but the level of change of repression and censorship is overnight. For February 24th, 2022 was a day that has changed, of course, Ukraine, but also Russia forever. Michael mentioned the law about fake news. Fake news in Russian is called fakey. It's borrowed from English, the word fake. And anything fake about the war, which is entirely up to them, is punishable by up to 15 years in jail. And students have been, it's especially common among students, have been arrested for holding up a blank piece of paper, for holding up a sign that says, instead of the words "no war," because the word war has been criminalized, it says 2 words. Though it says 2 words, because the 2 words are "no war," but you can't say "no war." Arrested for that. The universities have, from the level of the administrations, have all signed on to, there's a mass letter of support for the war from every single university rector of every single state institution in Russia, including the one that hosted our institute until 2019, saying that students who engaged in any anti-war activities or were even arrested by mistake by the police and released would be potentially expelled from the universities and conscripted into the army. That's the level now of repression that is going on within what used to be my second home. I'd like to also point your attention, you may have seen on the news, to the use of the letter Z as a symbol. It's not a letter of the Cyrillic alphabet, it's a letter of our alphabet, the letter Z, which is spray painted on the Russian tanks and on the Russian armored vehicles. They don't actually fly the Russian flag. They are now using the letter Z. That is what the army is using, but it has become a national symbol. It is such a fascist symbol, it makes me shudder. It looks so much like a swastika, and coming from a Jewish family that was expelled from Austria, before the Holocaust. It is just, I find this letter absolutely terrifying, and it is now, every metro station has an officially, not just people spray painting it on the wall, but there's an official stand that has a large letter Z behind glass. It says the little slogan, "We do not abandon our own." That is the kind of Orwellian propaganda that is going on. Students are under tremendous pressure, faculty are under tremendous pressure, and the result has been that there are plenty of people who support the war in Russia, and that's something else to talk about. But even those people, for everybody, the world changed on February 24th. People have been leaving in droves. I recommend very highly an article that we will somehow post for people to read by Masha Gessen about the recent mass departure of Russian civil society, actresses, musicians, journalists, not just people who, because of they might be activists, just because they cannot, their conscience will not allow them to stay, and teach their children that they have to not say the word war, and they have to not say the word invasion, because those words have been criminalized by extensive, there was nothing like that before February 24th, 2022, and people are all having to decide, should they leave everything they know, their entire lives, and many people are deciding to do that because this is just far beyond anything that they had seen before, including humanitarian organizations, organizations of orphans, organizations that help children with cancer. Many of those are led by these same cultural figures, actresses, and so on, who have decided to leave the country and and the association with them now has rendered those humanitarian, those NGOs, charity organizations, under extreme threat as well. And I'd just like to say one more thing, if I could. There's a very complicated question about the degree to which individual Russians now are being sanctioned and are being canceled. And I just want to tell you an experience that today I received the announcement for a Slavic linguistics conference that I often attend in Germany. Slavic linguistics, including many close Moscow and St. Petersburg and other Russian-based linguists, excellent linguists whom I know very well. And the conference has said, we will not invite contributions by scholars officially affiliated with any Russian institutions. This is a very tricky question, right? There's official sanctions against financial operations with Russian institutions. The degree to which this should be taken to include individuals, and the same question comes up with athletes, it comes up with musicians, it comes up with academics, and I do think that there's a cautionary tale there where we draw the line. I think anyone who supports the war in any way or supports the government should fall under that, but it's not clear that it should be extended beyond that.
Thank you so much, John Bailey. And now Leonie, Professor of Political Science here at Stony Brook. What about the domestic political situation and the public's attention span on the war?
Yes, so is this on? No. There we go. So I feel a bit of a ringer here because I don't study Ukraine or Russia, but I do study public opinion. And I'm also a political psychologist, so I look at public opinion from a psychological perspective. And I think it's a reasonable question to ask, would what is happening change views of the president, what's going on in American society? But I will also tell you, and don't shoot the messenger, that what you hear you may not like. When I tell you what's going on with the American public, these are not my views. I'm looking at public opinion polls and I'm trying to understand what's going on out there. So the reason why we might think something happens is there's a very common effect in foreign policy attitudes when the US engages in war, sends troops to other countries. It's called the rally effect. Typically, the public will rally around the president. Now, this occurs in part, typically, because leaders on both sides of the partisan divide will come together and support the president under those circumstances. I should also add that one of the types of political engagements that Americans are most supportive of when it comes to going to war or sending troops overseas is when American interests are at stake. And I will tell you that looking at polls, a bare majority of Americans, maybe fewer, think any American interests are at stake in the Ukraine. So this will tell you why, when I tell you that Americans are not as concerned as you are about the situation for various reasons, in part they don't think that this is something that they should be too engaged with. And we'll come back to the kind of information environment to which they're exposed that is telling them about this. There's a tremendous amount of news, you've all seen it. But not everyone engages with that news in the same way, not everyone is plugged in. And typically Americans approach these foreign policy situations with a lot of ignorance. They are not following foreign affairs very closely. This is very typical. People flunk geography tests constantly. They really don't know that much about the rest of the world. So I think we have to ask, should we have expected some kind of rally effect? We saw President Biden give his State of the Union address. There was a little bit of a bump, but I will tell you now, and you'll see this, that has dissipated and we're back to pretty much business as usual. When we look at ratings of President Biden. So there hasn't been any rally effect by any stretch of the imagination. Another reason why we might have expected some kind of greater unity around this, I think it goes back to what one of the journalists was saying, is that President Zelensky has said basically, this is a war for our values. This is a war of the West and democracy, freedom against autocracy. And so in some circumstances, we've seen this when we've studied other kinds of foreign engagements, there is a potential pro-Western sense of community, a sense of identity that could have pulled people together. But we haven't, so this is possible, but we really haven't seen that. And if you've been following the news, I noticed the other day that Tucker Carlson was suggesting that Ukraine is not a democracy. I don't know if I'm forced occasionally to read different kinds of news. And so he was specifically saying that Zelensky was not a Democrat, which is trying to puncture this sort of pro-Western unity. And this is coming from internal news sources in the United States to try and put a dent in that particular form of commonality with other individuals living in Western nations. So what is going on? I don't need to tell you this. We live in a highly partisan, polarized context. I don't think it could get much worse than this. Perhaps I'll be proven wrong, but things are looking pretty bad in terms of just how divided we are. I want to remind you, one of the reasons for this is that we have congressional elections approaching in some months from now. I think the Republican Party is thinking there's a potential for success, and so it's very, very important not to give an inch to the Democrats right now. So we have the heels dug in. This is a highly partisan situation. Now, having said that, when I look at the polls, there are areas of commonality among Americans. So, for example, people think Putin's a pretty bad guy, Republicans and Democrats. So we're united on that point, that Putin is not a good person. I think, in general, the majority of Americans are in favor of the kind of action that's involved sanctions. This has been popular. Of course, it was also subject to a bipartisan vote in the US Congress. So leadership has been telling us on both sides that this is one way to handle the situation. There's also support for sending weapons, which again, the US government has been doing, sending weapons to get into the hands of Ukrainians. So that's popular. I think you also know that there's no appetite for sending troops to Ukraine. The public does not support that, and we haven't really had that suggested. And on these points, perhaps Republicans are a little less supportive of sanctions than Democrats, but generally supportive. There aren't huge partisan differences on these points. So in one sense, the public is sort of supportive of what has been happening. Basically, there's support for things that have happened, there's opposition to the things that haven't happened. But that doesn't stop people from thinking that President Biden has not, if we look at the partisan divide, where does it occur? Whenever the name President Biden comes up. So once we politicize this again, and we have seen some evidence that Republicans would like more stronger action, although there's no evidence in the polls of what that stronger action could possibly be. There's no support for stronger action when those actions are suggested. But there is a critique of President Biden that he hasn't acted strongly enough. And I should add that I meant to say that President Biden was above 50% in approval ratings up until the Afghanistan withdrawal. And he has not really recovered from that. It dropped below 50%, and his numbers are floating around in the 42% range right now if we average across different polls, and that has not changed with this situation. So I think we have to be realistic about what's going on here. I've also seen some evidence that Americans don't think this is one of the most important things that's happening right now. They're more concerned about inflation, the economy. This is not necessarily top of the agenda. So I really put it in perspective. While we're very concerned about this, right now when politicians look at what's happening, they don't see huge appetite for extraordinary efforts on the part of the United States, and they're all very worried about what's going to happen in a few months, called the midterm elections.
Thank you. I think what you said is so important. This is an engaged audience. Please do everything that you can to keep people engaged in what's going on, because the American public, all the Western public, too easily will avert their gaze given the chance. Now, we're going to, as our final panelist here, it's Professor Sanders, and he's going to discuss Vladimir Putin.
If as Professor Huddy said, don't shoot the messenger, you may want to machine gun me. And that's the only funny thing I'm going to say. Vladimir Putin, people know he is A, president of Russia, B, a former KGB guy. That's not what's important. Vladimir Putin grew up in post-war Leningrad, a city that had survived almost 900 days of siege, a city in which his baby brother died, a city in which rats were eating corpses and people were eating corpses, a city that looked worse than bombed out Dresden. He grew up watching television. His heroes on early television were spies. Imagine James Bond, but reverse the values. Russian spies. He was an individualist. He was an alienated bad kid. Think about Marlon Brando in The Wild One. He played with rats. In fact, the rat is probably the best metaphor for him, not the nice little white rats that we see in the psychology labs, but really mean, vicious little rats whose predecessors survived the Second World War by eating people. He heard all the stories about the Second World War, including its prelude, and its prelude was something called the Winter War, in which the Soviet state, after failed negotiations, we now know there were a lot of negotiations that failed, with the West and particularly with Finland, invaded Finland on the last day of November 1939, and the Finns kicked the Russians tuchusses for 2 months. And then the Russians just overwhelmed them after they had taken enormous casualties and essentially took the land that they wanted. Mr. Putin was an individualist. His father was a true believing communist. And young Vladimir did not join the Young Communist League. Extremely unusual. He was a hooligan, a street kid. He survived school by getting involved in something called Sambo, which is I guess it's a mixed martial art, a martial art a little bit like judo, which has two leading principles. One, strike first and hard. Two, if you get smashed in the face, don't show any pain. This is what's more important to understand about Vladimir Putin. When he declared the special military operation on the 24th of February, he had a topic sentence. All of you need to write topic sentences, right? His topic sentence is, "We are taking this action to undo tragic events in the Donbass and key aspects of Russian security." This will link to the last extremely depressing set of points I'm going to make. What did he want in this action? To displace the drug-addled neo-Nazi regime. Neo-Nazi. The president of Ukraine is Jewish. How many Jewish Nazis do you know? He wanted to say no to NATO, to push NATO back from the frontiers of Russia, and back NATO arms further away from Russia. He wanted a neutral Ukraine. He wanted the Minsk Accords. This is a long digression about the Donetsk becoming independent republics, having to exist on a federalized basis. And he said, the West is trying to crush and dismantle Russia, and they're doing it through Ukraine. Ukraine is not a state. And he wanted it essentially, although he didn't say this, to reduce Ukraine, at least as configured since 1991. What are the possible outcomes of this war that Mr. Putin, the single man responsible for this devastation, might accept? Think of these as a bell curve, bell curve, extremes on both ends. I've come up with 6 points. 1, an orange upset. Orange is the color of the Ukrainian Revolution in 2014. It's one of the colored revolutions that so scare Mr. Putin.
2004, yeah.
2004. I'm not good with numbers, that's why I'm a word guy. An orange upset. Ukraine wins. Maybe they'll kill another 5 or 6 or 8 generals, and the generals will say back to the Kremlin, no more, buddy. We're just not going to do this. Question there is, they'll withdraw. Where will they withdraw to? 2, Governor Akins. Anyone know who Governor Akins was? Senator Akins from Vermont. Senator Akins from Vermont, in the middle of the debate on the Vietnam War, said, declare victory and go home. So one of my friends yesterday or the day before said, hurrah, hurrah, we победил. Hurrah, hurrah, we've won. Putin declares victory and he goes home. You'll notice a comment by another friend of mine in today's New York Times, Andrei Kortunov, who said no matter how this ends, Putin's got to have a happy ending. He's got to have an ending he likes. 3, culmination. Culmination, the great military strategist von Clausewitz said, culmination is when you get to a state of stasis where you have enough remaining strength to maintain a defensive position and wait for peace. Think about World War I. Think about the Somme, all the destruction there. Culmination, peace. Then the question we have to begin to talk about is partition. A partition of Ukraine. Who's going to get what? 4, winter war redux, or let's call it this, history's ugly rhymes. Mr. Putin decides to rhyme the lesson he learned from history, from the Winter War, in which Russia got bludgeoned at the beginning and then won by tremendous spreading of blood. Winter War meets Grozny. I was in Grozny for a good amount of time and got bombed every day. I might say if young Putin grew up on the legends of the 900 days of the siege of Leningrad, now that we're in a digital age, maybe it'll be 90 days or 180 days of a siege of Ukraine. 5.
Jonathan, we've got to have time for questions. So.
We will have time for questions. Mr. Putin said that he wanted to show what great power Russia has. Getting handed so many defeats may in fact get him to use tactical nuclear weapons to show what a great power he has. Boys like toys. He's already used his hypersonic missiles. Boys like toys. This is going to have 2 devastating consequences. One for Ukraine, one for Russia. It's going to drive the rest of the middle class out of Ukraine. It's going to drive much of the middle class out of Russia. In the future, how can either state have democracy without middle classes? And finally, number 6, Samson. Putin brings the whole house down, pushes the pillars, starts an international nuclear war, and the only victor then is China.
Well, on that thought, thank you so much. Thank you to all 4 of you for sharing your incredible experience. And thank you, Professor Saunders, for taking us through some potential endgames. Let's hope for a better ending than some of those ones that he has outlined. I'm going to take questions now, and if anybody wants to, I see already a hand has gone up. Can I, Professor Bailey, can I ask you to lend your microphone to people who are going to come forward? If you stand at the side, you can ask your question.
Students first.
Thank you.
Hello. You have to push that up.
Hello. Thank you. So, as everyone else, I'd like to thank you all for being here today. My question, primarily, I'd like to direct it towards Professor Heidi, as well as Professor Sanders, although I'm curious if all 4 of you have input. Specifically because of your comments about psychology. Obviously, we see other nations around the world, different companies, economic sanctions, all sorts of companies and governments making moves against Russia to sort of put the pressure on Putin to end the conflict or do whatever he needs to do to end the conflict. What is your opinion on all of the smaller, more segmented groups like the World Judo Organization, the International Chess Community, and their segregation of specifically Putin? For example, the martial arts community rescinding his 9th degree black belt. Do you fear the implication that things like that are going to have on a man like Putin?
You should answer that.
I'll bet. That bothers Vladimir Vladimirovich about as much as a mosquito bite. He doesn't care at all. He doesn't care at all. He also doesn't care about what the sanctions are doing to ordinary middle class and other people. It's already hitting in some places. Some stores are running out. There's a panic about sugar going on in Moscow right now. There's a panic of sugar going on everywhere else. And I think America's economic sanctions have been surprisingly effective in crushing the ruble. But that means all my friends are going to be suffering from it, not Mr. Putin. I think in the long term, if we could have full oil sanctions, that would do a lot more.
I'm not sure this is from you, but I wanted to add that if there are further economic consequences for Americans, this could further erode support for sanctions. We're already starting to see a little bit in the polls that, oh, what if the sanctions actually increase oil prices? Maybe not so great.
Interesting. Any other questions?
There's one.
far at the back, on the left. Lady, yes.
This is good work for a dean.
Hello, thank you. So I have a question about if there's concern that the sanctions could drive specifically the Russian public, general public, who may at first not have been in support of the war, drive them further against the West, further more into the ideology that that they're pushing, that NATO's out to get them, as well as about the rally effect. If the partisanship was a big issue for the rally effect, has there ever been a time in history where the time has passed for this now, but if the American public has ever rallied behind a sort of foreign president, or Zelensky had massive popularity here, if that could have been a possibility 2000?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the popularity of a foreign leader, I still think that the evidence is pretty clear that we need to be affected somehow for the public to be very strongly behind a war. And I think the most recent example was Afghanistan. So there, it was like virtually 90-something% of the public was fully in favor of sending troops to Afghanistan. Iraq war, not so much. And again, there was some confusion about what American interests really were in Iraq when the Bush administration went in 2003. So I think that partly answers your question. Well, the other question is about the psychology. I always think that a lot of this depends on the rhetoric that people are exposed to. It's not necessarily the direct effect of these particular events, it's how they're understood. And so in Ukraine, it may have been the case that I think Putin thought, well, we'll just go in there and it'll all be fine and people will cave. What was underestimated is how determined the public was and how Zelensky has, I think, managed to hold things together and prove himself to be a very strong group leader. I mean, his actions are pitch perfect for someone who is trying to lead a group of people through heroism and their own actions. You could not write this script better than the way he's played that out. So a lot of this is not just so much the actions, it's how it's understood. And if the Russians understand, we're doomed, like this, Russia has no future anymore for the middle class, then, they'll just, I think as John said, they'll leave. I mean, it looks hopeless to them. And maybe there is a segment that will rally against Putin, but I don't think everyone understands this in the same way.
Professor Orloff, you have a contribution right here.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me. I understand the Russian psychology, being Russian and being Ukrainian as well. What is striking is that how effective the Russian propaganda is. Russians perfected this propaganda machine for the previous 100 years, since 1917. And I can tell you, if you live in Russia and if you are consuming all the information, maybe half of you would think the West is evil. Because again, it's incredibly effective. The effectiveness of Russian propaganda is well outside Russia. My parents had a neighbor who is in Ukraine, who is very close to bombing sites, and he still say that, Russians are not targeting civilians. You can see Russians in the United States who are citizens, and they still consume the propaganda from the Russian media news, and they still believe that the war is justified. So this information bubble is very effective, and it's very difficult to puncture it, and therefore journalism and various means of puncturing this bubble and delivering this information is very important. Just a quick story about Putin himself and just to understand his psychology. My friend, she was in the British Foreign Office and she was dealing with Putin press conference. And during the press conference, Putin was asked about human rights in Russia. And what he's done was something completely different from any other foreign leader or dictator who ever visited the British Foreign Office. He took off his headphones and he said, they're broken. They're not broken, they're working perfectly well, but his audacity of lying is really incredible. He was a mediocre KGB officer, but what he didn't learn is how to lie properly. When he talks to camera, you see his eyes moving. He doesn't make the proper contact. But again, it's an individual with no moral and no compass, and currently in his career, there's a convergence between him being KGB officer and potential criminal. Now it's a pinnacle of his career when he is both.
Thank you. Next question.
Can I just add one little thing? I thought of something optimistic to say. The equivalent of the students in this room today in Moscow, in Peter. I teach occasionally there. I have students, I have good friends who teach every day, are totally appalled and ashamed of what's going on. They are against this war. A few brave ones have gone out and been arrested for demonstrating. They're going home and having the most rip-roaring arguments with their parents and their grandparents about the war. They have different media sources. But on the whole, most Russians, especially those over 45, get their news from television, which is Putin's biggest, bestest, most effective hammer, that it's evil America and the West doing this, and that we've got to get rid of those drug-addled neo-fascists in Ukraine.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 more questions with very brief answers. I see a couple of people lined up there. So, yes, you next, please.
So my question was actually about propaganda. What do you think the implications are for the future Russian generations? Because, like in terms of the consequences of the censorship and heavy information lockdown, because we see that like it's mirroring what has been happening in the Russian Revolution.
John Raylan, you've got 2 minutes on that, and then I can take one more.
I think it's clear to everybody there that this is different from anything we've seen before. So, I mean, I would say that it's exacerbating the extremes. So you have people who are just doubling down, and there's a kind of mass hysteria with the letter Z and all that other stuff, and that's a very loud segment. And then you see the students that Jonathan was talking about, and the students that we've seen who are definitely primarily against it. It's a matter of what they can do about it. But there's a huge middle who is now, in a certain sense, being forced to make some kind of decision that they never had to before, because the severity of the sanctions and the severity of the propaganda war, whether they believe it or not, they know that it's of a totally different character than it ever was before. It's something is very, very wrong if the entire world is reacting like this. It might be that they double down, and it might be, but they're not going to be able to kind of continue to be neutral about that, and everybody, and so it's kind of unpredictable, I think, what's going to happen, because we've never seen anything like this before.
Thank you. And then I would love this to go on forever, but another class is going to start here in 5 minutes. So over to you with your question, please.
I have a question for Professor Orloff. I wanted to ask you about how the Ukrainian people feel about the Western support. Is it adequate enough? Is it inadequate enough? And given a Russian occupation, how are the Ukrainian people going to react?
Well, Ukrainians are grateful for all the support because without the weapons, it wouldn't be possible to achieve this breaking point where Russia stalled. Ukrainians are grateful for support of the American military, which is teaching them the tactics on how to fight fairly inefficient and outdated Russian army. But they also feel a little bit abandoned in the way that they cannot fight Russians in the air. Yeah. And this discussion about not providing planes or, God forbid, alienating Putin, he never thought about like doing the covert operations, lying and supplying weapons to the insurgents. I'm not suggesting that America needs to do the same. We have moral grounds to be better than him, but there's a way of creativity and solving it in a different way. But again, even if Ukraine fails, which hopefully would not happen, there would be resistance, and Russia would never prevail. Morally, they're wrong, and that's the driving force for Ukrainians.
Well, I think that was a great question to end on, and thank you for your answer, Professor Orloff. help here in Long Island, in the community here. You can go online and places to donate. And please do everything you can to spread the message about this war and to keep Americans engaged in what's going on in the world. Thank you for coming. Thank you for Professor Baird, Professor Sanders, Professor Huntley, and Professor Orloff. And thank you very much to all of you.
Very cautious, very cautious.